Music often echoes history, and perhaps the most famous piece of historical music ever written is Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. Not only because it's so dramatic, but also because the year 1812 was a milestone in European history. But it was also a year of great significance in the history of Canada, which had an 1812 of its own. In fact, the two 1812s were closely related.
Niagara, an Iroquoian word meaning thunder of water. The great waterfall in the river, which links Lake Erie with Lake Ontario. On one side of this Niagara River is the United States. On the other, only about 200 meters away, lies Canada. In October of 1812, the Canadian bank of the Niagara River, known as Queenston Heights, was invaded by an American army. This was the first important engagement in a conflict that would continue for 2 years, but which would become known simply as the War of 1812. To understand why the United States launched an attack on Canada at this particular moment, we have to go to Europe, then embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte, who was now Emperor of France, was doing his level best to take over the world, and he very nearly succeeded. By the early 1800s, Napoleon had assembled one of the mightiest armies in history and was undertaking the systematic conquest of country after country. By 1812, Napoleon dominated virtually the whole of Europe, right up to the borders of Russia. The only thing stopping him from expanding his empire beyond Europe was the all-powerful British Navy, which had sealed off almost the entire continent with a huge blockade of warships, thus preventing Napoleon's fleet from getting out of any of the French-controlled ports. The trouble was, the British blockade also prevented anyone from getting into the European ports as well. This included the Americans, whose economy was now becoming more and more dependent on trade with Europe. This blow to their business interests naturally turned the United States once more against the mother country. The British made things even worse by boarding U.S. ships on the high seas in search of deserters from the extremely harsh life in the Royal Navy, often press-ganging American sailors into the service of His Majesty at the same time. Meanwhile, back on this continent, the U.S. population was continuing to expand rapidly, spreading ever further west in search of new territory. British North America seemed the logical next step in the U.S. takeover of the continent, and the Napoleonic Wars provided the perfect opportunity. On the one hand, the British troops were now tied down in Europe fighting Napoleon, so Canada should be easy pickings. On the other hand, the British interruption of American trade with Europe and their high-handed raids on American ships presented the United States with a convenient excuse for declaring war on Great Britain and invading Canada. So the American attack on Queenston Heights in the autumn of 1812 was to a large extent an offshoot of the Napoleonic Wars. Once again, there was a crucial French connection in the evolution of North America. If the Americans had won their war of independence thanks to the intervention of France, they now seemed all set to win Canada thanks to Napoleon.
In the year 1812, there was a struggle for survival on two continents. Europe was on the point of being taken over by France, and Canada seemed about to be taken over by the United States. But at the end of that year, an event occurred that was to foil both of these takeover bids.
This looks like a Canadian winter, but it isn't. It's a Russian winter. And the key to understanding both how Canada avoided being annexed by the United States in the early 1800s and how Europe escaped becoming a mere extension of France. Once again, Napoleon was at the center of all this. Having conquered almost all of Europe, by the middle of 1812, he turned his attention to Russia and marched a gigantic army of over 500,000 men from Poland to Moscow. This was his fatal mistake. Napoleon took Moscow itself easily enough in the autumn of that year, but when he demanded that Tsar Alexander surrender his Russian Empire to France, the Tsar stood firm, and Napoleon had no alternative but to retreat. Unfortunately, winter was now coming on, and Napoleon's men had to fight their way back through thousands of kilometers of snow and ice. Out of a total of 600,000 troops, only 30,000 survived. Napoleon never fully recovered from this disaster. From then on, he was to lose more and more of his battles with the other European states, until, by the end of 1814, all the lands he had conquered beyond the borders of France had been returned to their former owners. But if the retreat from Moscow had saved Europe from French domination, it was also to be one of the major factors in saving Canada from assimilation by the United States. During most of the War of 1812, because of Britain's involvement in the Napoleonic Wars, she could only send a token force of a few thousand men to defend British North America. This encouraged the Americans to attack Canada on several fronts, including Queenston Heights on the Niagara River, York, the capital of Upper Canada, later called by its original Indian name Toronto, and the southern approaches to Montreal. Although a combination of British, Canadian, and native troops put up a valiant fight under the leadership of such men as Isaac Brock and his Shawnee Indian ally Tecumseh in Upper Canada, and Charles de Salaberry in Lower Canada, it still seemed inevitable that the United States must eventually overrun British North America, if only by sheer force of numbers. But then the tide turned, or rather, the snow fell in that calamitous Russian winter, which ultimately led to the collapse of France. At last, Britain could release troops from her struggle with Napoleon and send them across the Atlantic. Now, it was America's turn to be invaded, as the British Army marched on various strategic sites in the U.S. The symbolic climax of this invasion was the capture and burning of the American capital, Washington, in retaliation for the burning of the parliamentary buildings at York. This included the desecration of the presidential mansion itself, which was subsequently rebuilt and painted a dazzling white, as if in an act of purification. Soon, both sides came to realize that this was a senseless conflict, and on Christmas Eve, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, bringing a formal end to the War of 1812. This actually left the territorial division of North America exactly as before. The only new development being the subsequent extension of the frontier in 1818, along the 49th parallel, all the way to the Rocky Mountains. The War of 1812 ended in stalemate, but it discouraged the Americans from ever again mounting a direct attack on this country.
Canada's struggle for survival with the United States, which culminated in the War of 1812, was centered on Upper and Lower Canada, roughly corresponding to southern Ontario and southern Quebec today. But to the west of this region, there was another tug of war going on during the late 17 and early 1800s. And the two rival groups involved in this contest were both based in British North America itself.
This is a reconstruction of Fort William, a British fur trading post which was originally built in 1803 at Thunder Bay on the northwestern shore of Lake Superior. But Fort William was not the property of the Hudsons Bay Company, as might have been expected. Instead, it belonged to its bitter enemy, the Northwest Company. The story of the feud that developed between these two fur empires dates back to the fall of New France in 1760. Among the English-speaking immigrants who arrived in Montreal in the wake of the British conquest were a number of businessmen of Scottish ancestry. Entrepreneurs such as James McGill, Simon McTavish, and William McGilvery, who were later to be joined by Alexander Mackenzie, Simon Fraser, and the Welsh adventurer David Thompson. Under the new British regime in Canada, these men fell heir to the French-Canadian fur trading business, complete with its army of voyageurs. At first, the Anglo-American Montrealers and their French-Canadian partners were split into a variety of small independent companies. But in the late 1770s, they banded together into one large organization, the Northwest Company. Along with the voyageurs, the Nor'westers had also inherited the entire New France fur trading network, based on the St. Lawrence and stretching as far west as the Saskatchewan River. The Nor'westers subsequently extended this network to Lake Athabasca and went on to explore even further. Alexander Mackenzie traveled the river that is named after him all the way to the Arctic Ocean, and then finally succeeded in traversing the Rockies and reaching the Pacific Ocean itself, where he and his voyageurs became the first Europeans to cross the full breadth of North America from coast to coast. Mackenzie was followed by another partner in the Northwest Company, Simon Fraser, who in 1808 made his way to the Pacific down a river which he also named after himself. And finally, in 1811, again on behalf of the Northwest Company, David Thompson discovered yet another route to the Pacific via the Columbia River. The Nor'westers now spanned the continent, running an annual 5,000-kilometer fur shuttle between Lake Athabasca and Montreal. This entailed setting up a chain of intermediate trading posts, the most important of which was Fort William. Of course, all this was very bad news indeed for the Hudsons Bay Company, who, after the demise of New France, had fully expected to enjoy a complete monopoly of the Canadian fur trade and to continue sitting comfortably on the shores of Hudson Bay, leaving the Indians to do all the pelt gathering in the interior. But now, the men of the bay risked being put out of business by the men of the river, who were reaching further and further behind them to the west. So the bay hastily started setting up its own inland fur trading posts. Soon, rival Hudson's Bay and Northwest Company forts were leapfrogging one another across the prairies, in a neck-and-neck race for fresh supplies of fur, with frequent murderous clashes between the employees of the two firms. Both sides could also be quite ruthless in seducing the native trappers to their cause, bribing them with liberal supplies of rot-gut alcohol. But in spite of all the best efforts of the Hudsons Bay Company, the Nor'westers were nearly always just one step ahead. By the end of the 1700s, the Northwest Company controlled fully 9/10 of the North American fur business. In the battle between the bay and the river seemed to be winning hands down.
The great success of the Northwest Company during the last quarter of the 1700s didn't last very long into the next century, because the Nor'westers could only keep ahead of the bay by going ever further west. When there was no more west to advance into, they were in trouble. But the coup de grâce was administered not directly by the Hudsons Bay Company, but indirectly by the establishment of the very first European settlement in Western Canada.
If we want a reminder of what led to the final disappearance of the Northwest Company, we have only to look at this city, Winnipeg, which is situated at the junction of the Red River and the Assiniboine River, in the region now known as Manitoba. This is the site of Canada's first European colony west of the Great Lakes. In 1812, the same year the Americans invaded Canada at Queenston Heights, a small party of Scottish immigrants with much more peaceable intentions landed on the banks of the Red River. Like so many previous arrivals on this continent from Britain, they were small tenant farmers who had been forced off their lands to make room for large-scale sheep grazing. But these families were more fortunate than most in that their settlement in British North America had been sponsored by a wealthy Scottish aristocrat, the Earl of Selkirk. Taking advantage of a slump in the affairs of the Hudsons Bay Company, Lord Selkirk had bought a controlling interest in the bay and had acquired a grant of land centered in the Red River region. An enormous territory, 5 times the size of Scotland, covering most of southern Manitoba and overlapping large chunks of what are now Saskatchewan, Minnesota, and North Dakota. Fertile prairie land that seemed an ideal place for the Scottish settlers to build a new life for themselves. But Selkirk had chosen the region for more than its agricultural potential. This also seems to have been a deliberate move to undermine the Northwest Company, because this land lay right across their main trade route to the west. An area which was also of vital importance to the Nor'westers, because this is where they got most of their provisions in the form of buffalo meat. To understand how this worked, we have to remember that the whole region had been inhabited long before Selkirk's settlers arrived by the Plains Indians, who had been hunting the buffalo on the prairies for millennia. In addition to the pureblood Indians, there were also several thousand people of mixed descent living here. They were the product of the extensive intermarrying that had been going on for some 200 years between the native peoples and the French coureurs de bois and voyageurs, and more recently, the Scottish fur traders of the Northwest Company. Since the French word for to mix blood is métisse, these people of dual Indian white ancestry were known as métis or métis. Like the full-blood Plains Indians, the Métis also hunted the buffalo and made their living supplying buffalo meat to the Nor'westers. But now, into the middle of this Northwest Company-dominated territory, with its substantial hunting population of Indians and Métis, came Lord Selkirk of the Hudsons Bay Company with his farmers from Scotland. Since the Métis feared, with some justification, that this settlement would interfere with their buffalo meat trade, they soon began harassing the little colony. The showdown came in 1816 at a place called Seven Oaks, near the banks of the Red River. In a particularly violent confrontation, the governor and 20 of his settlers were killed. Although the colony subsequently recovered from this Seven Oaks massacre and was ultimately to evolve into the city of Winnipeg, for the Northwest Company, it was the beginning of the end. Selkirk soon took retaliatory measures, which resulted in a seemingly endless series of legal battles between the two fur empires that almost bankrupted both of them. Eventually, the British government decided to put a stop to the dispute, and in 1821 passed an act of parliament confirming the merger of the Nor'westers with the Hudsons Bay Company. Although Montreal would continue to play a key role in transcontinental commerce, it was now out of the fur business, which would henceforth be controlled exclusively by the Hudsons Bay Company. The bay had finally swallowed the river.
So far in surveying what was happening here at the end of the 1700s and beginning of the 1800s, we've looked at the Hudsons Bay Northwest Company rivalry in Western Canada and the War of 1812 in Upper and Lower Canada. Atlantic Canada was relatively tranquil during this period, escaping attack by the Americans in the 1812 war because of its close ties with New England and the strong British naval presence in Nova Scotia. But Pacific Canada also began to come into the picture during the second half of the 1700s, with several different nations competing for control of the Northwest coast.
If the beaver is the key to understanding the evolution of first Eastern, then Central, then Western Canada, the evolution of Pacific Canada begins with this animal, the sea otter. A creature which had been hunted for thousands of years by the native peoples of the region. In the north, the Aleuts of the Aleutian Islands. And further south, Indians such as the Tlingit, the Haida, the Tsimshian, and the Nootka. By the middle of the 1700s, the sleek, soft pelts of the sea otter, perhaps the finest of all furs, had also become the rage in the Old World. But the European exploitation of these animals didn't originate from Western Europe. It began in Russia. In the year 1725, Tsar Peter the Great instructed the Danish navigator Vitus Bering to see if he could find a way to the New World via Siberia. This led Bering to discover the strait separating Asia from America, which is still named after him. But what really excited the Russians was the discovery that Bering made along the coast of Alaska and British Columbia of vast numbers of sea otters. Eager to corner this very lucrative market, Russia promptly claimed possession of the region. From the 1740s onwards, more and more Cossack fur traders from Siberia began hunting the sea otter on the northwest coast in the same feverish manner with which the beaver was being pursued on the mainland. Because of her involvement in this fur trade, Russia was in fact to retain control of Alaska right up until 1867. But the arrival of the Russians also stirred New Spain into action. Fearing that the Tsar might soon take over the entire Pacific coast, in the 1770s, the Spanish planted a string of settlements in California, from San Diego to Los Angeles to San Francisco. They then moved further up the coast to British Columbia, which they claimed sovereignty over in 1774. But BC wasn't to remain Spanish for long. In 1778, the British arrived in the person of Captain James Cook of the Royal Navy, who was scouring the Pacific Ocean in search of the elusive Northwest Passage. Like the Russians, Cook was greatly excited by the potential wealth he saw in the sea otters, and immediately set about trying to establish British rights over the region. Accompanying Cook was Captain George Vancouver, who soon began charting large areas of the BC coastline, giving English names to numerous landmarks, including the island which now bears his name. In 1793, Vancouver explored an inlet which he christened Dean's Channel, just 6 weeks before that other British adventurer, Alexander Mackenzie, was to approach the same channel from the other direction. Britain now had a double claim to ownership of the North Pacific coast. Maritime, thanks to Vancouver, and overland, thanks to Mackenzie. Although the arrival of the British led to several skirmishes with the Spanish, Britain's naval power soon prevailed. From the mid-1790s on, the Spanish flag over Pacific Canada was replaced by the Union Jack, which flew over a land now revealed to the Europeans from Buena Vista to the Vancouver Island, from the Arctic Circle to the Great Lakes waters. An adventure story which had begun with the beaver on the Atlantic Ocean ended with the sea otter on the shores of the Pacific.